Well, good morning or good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are. I have with me Dr. Günter Bechly, and we have the list of questions that people submitted after Günter gave his talk on Neo-Darwinian evolution and the evidence against it from the fossil record. So Dr. Bechly is one of those wonderful, wonderful scientists, and we are very privileged to have him here as a guest of the Science and Culture Network of Southern California, and also of the Colorado chapter. So this is a joint effort. And Dr. Bechly, thank you. And I'm just going to read these questions. I also want to tell you that I have taken off the names. There were many people who put their names on the questions, and then other people said that they did not want their names to be read because they didn't want people to know who they were. So I have stripped the names off, but and there were one or two questions, Dr. Bechly, who I changed a little bit so that I could, for instance, update the spelling or the some of the words a little bit, so it'd make it a little bit easier to understand. So, ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. First question. How do animals transform into different species in your view? From normal reproduction, and suddenly there's a sudden transformation between the mother and the son, or some completely different process like separate creation. So what is possible?
So, okay. So possible, of course, is a lot of stuff. So I think generally possible, depending on your background metaphysics. If you're a materialist, then of course only Darwinian evolution would be possible. If you are not a materialist, not an atheist, then other things are also possible. So it could be also a special creation. I suppose that the question is not so much focused on the question, how do new species arise? Because even most hardcore young Earth creationists wouldn't be too much impressed by the fact that one bird species gives rise to other very similar looking bird species. So I think the question probably rather focused to this issue of how do new organs arise. Did some kind of dinosaur give birth to a bird or something like that? Ideas like that have been discussed also in mainstream science. There was a famous biologist called Richard Goldschmidt who had this idea of hopeful monsters, which is basically this idea that a reptile gave birth to the first bird. And I'm a little bit sympathetic to this idea. I think that evolution is, if it happens at all, a saltational process that requires this information input and then has relatively large changes in relatively short time. If this means that a reptile or dinosaur without feathers gave birth directly to something looking like a bird is a different question. But I think that I would favor a view in lines with this kind of idea, that you had these big changes on a few generation level. But there are other options, of course, as well. So it depends on the evidence, and we should just let the evidence decide which is the best explanation for speciation.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, here's another one. What about insect and other early organism intelligence? Is there evidence for brains or a control device, if you will, evolving? Or rather, didn't they just also show up fully formed in the Cambrian explosion or before? These creatures were directed in their actions by neurons or something like them. And is it without evolutionary precursor?
Yes. So insects, of course, they don't appear in the Cambrian explosion. The oldest insects we know appear in the Devonian about 420 million years ago. But what we do have in the Cambrian explosions are arthropods, completely modern looking arthropods in terms of their body plan. So they have compound eyes and they have an exoskeleton and they have these articulated appendages and look like some kind of shrimp or some kind of horseshoe crab. And these arthropods, there's no evidence that the nervous system or the brain evolved. Actually, we do have from the Cambrian some fossils from the Chinese Shenyang Formation where there is the nervous system preserved in those fossils, because these tissues were replaced during the fossilization process by minerals and can still be distinguished from other tissues. And there you see the ganglia, so the brain of these arthropods, and the total nervous system of in the body. And these are relatively modern or totally modern looking nervous systems. So they appear as suddenly as the other features of the body plans in the Cambrian explosion. So there is no evidence there that this evolved gradually by small steps, first one nervous cell and then a second, and then you have a pair of ganglia, and then you have a larger brain in these arthropods. Even in these earliest forms, we have very highly developed arthropod nervous systems preserved.
And let me ask you, I'm just going to ask a little follow-up question. This is one of my own, and I believe that Sean Carroll said that the body plans for large, complex animal bodies showed up in their DNA, actually like millions of years, like 50 million years before, like some of those body plan types and everything, that would probably be for the nervous systems, are also found in bacteria DNA. Is that correct? Or
no? What is true is that you can find some patterns in the DNA that go back, let's say, before organisms that were multicellular, that have this kind of complex animal type body plan. But the idea behind this argument from Sean Carroll, which is, by the way, the Sean Carroll, the evolutionary biologist, not the Sean Carroll, the physicist, yes, which coincidentally have the same names. And he has written this book about evolution, I think something like Forms Most Beautiful, or I don't remember the precise title. And the problem is that in the meantime, it has been discovered that it's not just an issue of certain DNA modules, not just of let's say, the so-called Hox genes, that could maybe predate the complex body plans, and then it was just a question of putting these modules like Legos together in a different way. What has been shown in the past years, and that is a relatively recent finding, is that for all these body plan changes, there had to arise new proteins. That is something that even in response to Steve Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt, was presented as a kind of counter argument. Maybe new proteins were not necessary and we didn't need new genetic information, and we could just use all these genetic modules that were already present, maybe in unicellular precursors. But that's not true. We need new proteins, that has been shown, and they require new genetic information. And then you get this waiting time problem, that the time for the Cambrian explosion is much too short to allow for these new genes and new proteins to arise, even if you, for the sake of the argument, grant that you would have these genetic modules at your disposal to play with it. But that's not sufficient to make these body plans.
Interesting. All right, thank you. Okay, next question. Do you have any mechanistic suggestion for how your explanation of the discontinuities in the fossil record happen? Are they by infusion of information? And how could that have taken place?
That's a question that you often hear, actually, because that is one of the common critiques of intelligent design. Theory is that, what is your mechanism? How did it happen? Do you just say God did it or something? The first thing, because before I will tell you about my idea about the potential mechanism, is that we are not supposed to present a mechanism. You can detect the fact of design without knowing anything about the mechanism. How came this design about? If you find some artifact on Mars which looks like a machine or like a kind of complex writing on a cave wall, you don't have to know who these aliens were that produced this or how they did it with what kind of technology to detect the fact of design, that this was not a product of erosion on Mars, but an effect of design. So, but nevertheless, of course, you can speculate about potential mechanism. And of course, many design theorists which have a theist background will refer to the possibility of divine interventions, which is a possibility. If you have a creator God who created the universe and made the laws of nature, then he can also interact in space-time and bring things about that he wants to have, for which reason, whatever. But there are also other possibilities, that this process is more subtle, and that God, or whoever the designer is, uses secondary sources. And one idea that I have together with a colleague is that processes from quantum biology play a role, that parts of DNA could be in a state of quantum superposition, and that they could collapse into mutations that are not random, but are adaptive, macro mutation, large changes that have an advantage, that are goal-directed, that are not just randomly happening without a purpose in mind. And it would happen because in this quantum mechanical wave function, those mutations that have an advantage would populate more branches of the wave function. So the collapse of the wave function would more likely happen in those branches than in others. So that's a little bit complicated idea, but basically it's possible to have a kind of mechanism that would then only require an infusion of information at the start of the system, outside of time, in the way how this mathematical possibility space is shaped. But the rest would be a kind of quantum computation going on during evolution. So there are possibilities. It's not like intelligent design is without ideas how something like this could happen. Other ideas are come from information technology and are analogies to software design. So I think there will a lot of new ideas will come when design becomes more mainstream and more people think about this.
Yeah, that's very good, because I know that there are several people who think about it, and they think that possibly, we're living in some kind of a
Simulation.
Yeah, simulation of some sort.
Yes,
If we're in a simulation, it's no problem to infuse new information from outside, right, if you're the programmer.
Actually, I'm sympathetic to the idea, and I think Christians should embrace this idea, because the only difference I would have with some crazy simulation theorists like Elon Musk is that I don't think that the simulation can happen in a computer, because this would involve a lot of problems and lead to an infinite regress. I think the simulation, if it is a simulation, is in the mind of God and not in a computer. Yes. But the arguments for this theory are pretty solid. So I have another lecture which you can find on YouTube, which also discusses these ideas of simulation theory in a theistic context. Interesting,
very interesting. So let's see. All right, let's go on to the next one. That's a very deep subject, So for me personally, I always think about, if we are living in a simulation, then there's a lot of programming that takes place. And programming by definition is intentional. Process. Yes. And it's always the product of a mind. So, there's such exquisite programming that you find in all of the things of nature, that how can it just be this random thing? People that say that are not thinking about it from the context of trying to do the programming that would have brought it. No, the programmers immediately say, if you randomly change bits in a functionally specified software, then all you get is noise, and just some iterations of introducing noise will break your software. So it cannot work. Yeah, it cannot work. Okay, well, we have many questions, so we'll keep going on. Okay, there are many irregular exceptions from the traditional fossil record. I mean, completely different fossils which appear out of order in the same local source. And would you care to reflect on how that happens? Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because maybe you have heard Richard Dawkins saying, well, Darwinian evolution would be refuted if you would find a Cambrian rabbit.
And this goes back to a quote from one of the fathers of the modern evolutionary theory, but Dawkins made it popular. And the funny thing is that Dawkins seems to be quite unaware of the fossil record, and that this happens actually quite frequently, that you have these so-called out-of-place fossils that are not just a little bit out of order, but very much out of order. So there's, for example, a land plant described from a Chinese locality of the genus Parafunaria. And this predates the supposed origin of land plants for about 100 million years or longer. So that's totally out of order. And what happened, it didn't refute Darwin's theory, it was basically ignored. So the same happened with some relatively modern insect that has been discovered in the Rhynie Chert, which is a Devonian locality from Scotland. And this was very unwelcome because that was a modern insect that is adapted to flowering plants, which certainly didn't exist in the Devonian. And so the only publication that ever dealt with this fossil said, well, maybe it somehow entered the stone secondarily and is a modern insect. So maybe the stone was dissolved, this mineral, and then a modern insect through some cracks in the earth entered, and then it remineralized. And the funny thing is, even if this could be possible, which is very disputable, then what you should do is really look at this fossil with different observation methods of modern microscopy and see, is there evidence that the matrix of this mineral remineralized and that this is really a secondary phenomenon. But nobody ever looked at this fossil again, and it was again ignored by mainstream evolutionary biology. So there are such out-of-place fossils, and they are not used as conflicting evidence for Darwin's theory, but they are basically ignored, or you just find, as in the case of Parafunaria, 4 or 5 quotations when you Google this. And then one quotation says, well, I don't remember now the real name of the publication, Smith 2019 said this is demonstrably a hoax or is demonstrably misstated. And then you look at this publication, and this publication cites another publication. And in this publication, you find just one line, I don't think that this is valid or without argument. So you find this kind of circular quoting, and ultimately you end up with no argument at all. And this is used to explain away unpleasant conflicting evidence. So that is actually present, and what we make of it, it could be evidence against common descent, because this doesn't really fit this progressive lineage through time. I'm rather, because I think the overall evidence is still better for common descent, to think that they are evidence that our picture of how evolution allegedly developed is wrong. But there is definitely strange evidence that requires more research and more looking at the conflicting evidence and not ignoring it.
Yes, I think it was really interesting in your talk. One of the things that I personally found really interesting was that land animals came before the fish. Yeah. And so that's completely against what, you know, you're taught.
That's also out of order in a way, yes, because the supposed descendant is much older than all the supposed ancestors, and that of course cannot be. So that is the reason why then evolutionists, paleontologists have to come up with all these kind of ad hoc explanations like ghost lineages that postulate long periods of undocumented existence for these lineages. So yeah, it's interesting.
It's interesting. Okay, let's go to another part of this question. This is from the same submission, and it says, how do you respond to the tautology or repetition of the average Darwinist claims? I mean, it is like it is as if they say it, if they say it enough times, they believe it. If we can't use common phylogenetics or perhaps phenetics or modern science like molecular biology, but the fossil record must match to the stratigraphic columns in the textbooks. Well, it's got a lot of technical information, so maybe you can explain
Okay, yeah.
a little bit.
Let's first explain some terms, and then also because the question is a little bit difficult to understand, I will try to unpack it, what probably is meant by the question. So some of the terms are phylogenetics. That is simply the discipline to try to reconstruct trees of relationship. Like your personal ancestry trees, to look which animals are more closely related to which other animals, and then come up with these tree-like diagrams. Phonetics is a different method to do this, using computer calculations and calculating overall similarity as a guide to supposed relationship. It's basically an obsolete method that is not longer used today. Most methods used today use DNA comparison with Bayesian or maximum likelihood calculations. So there are modern approaches to use computerized reconstruction of trees based on lots of data from DNA data or lot of morphological characters. So that is one thing. The other expression is stratigraphy, and stratigraphy is just the discipline in geology, the order of the geological column in terms of, if you go deeper back in history, then you go also deeper in terms of depth you have to dig. So the oldest layers are the layers beneath, and the younger layers are the layers on top, unless you have some strange processes where things get folded or erosion and redeposition and so on. But usually in an undisturbed environment, the older layers are beneath and the younger layers are up, and then you have a kind of order of the fossils appearing only in certain layers of a certain age. And this discipline is called stratigraphy. So what the question is referring to is that on the one hand, we calculate trees based on comparison of morphology and DNA similarity. And then we get these branching patterns which show that there is a certain order in which order did groups appear. So there are more primitive groups branching first, and then more derived groups branching later. And we should expect that we find this order reflected in the appearance of these groups in the fossil record. And there's actually a technical terms for this, and that is stratigraphic fit. Do the phylogenies, the reconstructed trees, fit with the order of appearance in the geological column of these fossils? So do really the primitive forms that branch first in the tree also appear first in the geological column? This can happen, and it often also does happen, but it often also does not happen. And so, of course, Darwinists now take the cases where it does happen, good stratigraphic fit, as evidence for common ancestry. And I tend to agree that overall it's evidence for common ancestry that is well explained by common ancestry. But what they don't do is, when there is poor stratigraphic fit and bad stratigraphic fit, to say, well, this is conflicting evidence against common ancestry, which of course you should do. You cannot just cherry pick the evidence that fits your theory and ignore the evidence that doesn't fit your theory. And there are a lot of examples of this poor stratigraphic fit. One is, again, this thing with tetrapods, where the ancestors are older, the ancestors are younger, the supposed ancestors, as the first record of the supposed descendants. And there are different approaches that Darwinists came up to deal with this. One is this postulating of ghost lineages, to say, well, of course, the descendants must be older, therefore we postulated that they existed long before they were first recorded in the fossil record. That is one possibility. It's, of course, an ad hoc explanation. If the other data really favor the theory of common ancestry, then it's a valid ad hoc explanation, but you still have to recognize that it's conflicting evidence. And if this conflicting evidence accumulates and would, let's say, come to a tipping point where you say, well, this refutes common ancestry, then you can no longer explain this stuff away with these kind of ad hoc hypotheses. And another approach has been to really fudge your methodology. And there has been one approach called, let me remember, because it's now basically obsolete, not longer used. I think it was called something like stratocladistics. I think it was stratocladistics. And what they used is they took the dating of the fossils into the phylogenetic calculations as data. So they didn't only compare anatomical similarity, they also put in the age of a fossil as a kind of primitive character and the younger age of another fossil as a kind of derived character. And this had as effect that you could avoid an incorrect order in the phylogenetic trees compared to the fossil appearance. So it's a kind of cheating in a way. Because if you would have just looked at the anatomical differences, you would have had a conflicting evidence. So these are the attempts to deal with this conflicting evidence, but it definitely exists and poses a problem.
Interesting. So you could easily say from what you just said that sometimes the scientists are not going where the data leads.
No. They have their favorite hypothesis in the back of their mind, and they look for more for supporting data than conflicting data. And then you have this idealistic view that many people, also like Dawkins or others, say, well, science, and there's nothing more happy for a scientist than to refute this theory. This is, of course, rubbish in practice. Every scientist wants to confirm his theory and tries to fight everybody who tries to refute his theory, because there's a lot of ego-centric things going on, and it's also about grant money and influence and so on. So it's not like the theory requires that scientists always behave.
Yes. So anyway, a lot of human emotion in there rather than evidence.
Yes, definitely, like everywhere.
So, okay, well, let me go down to, so we had several questions about soft tissue. And at the end of your talk, you answered a few of these, but I think it's an important question about this whole issue of soft tissue being discovered in like 65 million-year-old dinosaur bones.
Right.
And, you know, I personally, like if I find an old bone out in my yard or something that the dog got a hold of, you know, it's like old and dried out. I don't get where they think it's like soft tissue, but anyway, you can explain that for us.
Yeah, it's of course not to be expected. It's a very rare phenomenon, and that is something I would also, let's say, give at least as a idea to think about to those young Earth creationists who well say these soft tissues in dinosaurs are evidence for young Earth creation. And I would agree it's among the best evidence for a young Earth view, this preservation of still mobile tissues in dissolved bones of dinosaurs. The problem is, why is it so rare? So if these bones would all only be 5,000 years old, if I look at bones that are found in archaeological excavation, then we find these kinds of soft tissue preservation much more frequent than in dinosaur bones that are supposed to be millions of years old. So this should be the rule if the young Earth view is correct rather than an exception. But still the question, of course, is how can it be that something like this is preserved over millions of years? So one thing one has to keep in mind when one reads technical publications that speak about soft tissue preservation is that in 90% of those publications, and this doesn't refer to the dinosaur case, but in other cases, it doesn't mean that the original organic substance is preserved. It just means that this soft tissue of muscles or of the nervous system or of the outline of the body has been preserved by a kind of remineralization where the original organic tissue has been replaced by minerals and it's still visible, but it's not mobile or still preserved in its organic composition. It's a little bit different in some cases. There are plant fossils from the Tertiary which are still mobile and still have organic material preserved. And there are these tissues in dinosaurs that have been preserved. Mostly it's collagen, which is the most most durable among the proteins in a body. And there have been some ideas, how could this be preserved? Because as you said, usually, of course, an animal that dies is not preserved as a fossil at all. If your bird dies in your garden, it rots and gets eaten by ants, and it's not preserved as a fossil. So you need very rare conditions where a carcass is embedded in sediments under exclusion of air, so that no decay processes can go on, so that a fossil can be preserved at all. And to have now these soft tissues preserved, there have been ideas. It's not totally solved, the problem. Some ideas involve microbial activity around these tissues of anaerobic bacteria that help to preserve these tissues. There are other ideas that involve iron ions in the preservation process of these blood vessels, which are very high in iron content. And there was a recent paper showing that collagen could be preserved in a mobile way by a kind of polymerization, which would mean that these tissues were transformed by the fossilization process in a kind of plastic or rubber like substance. So there are ideas. There is a book by Fazale Rana from Reasons to Believe, who is a Christian and who is a creationist, an old earth creationist, who has written a book about the soft tissues of dinosaurs, where he presents the case that even he, as a Christian creationist, thinks that these are not evidence for young earth creation, even though they are remarkable cases of preservation. And I share his estimate. So it's strange. It's not totally explained, but I think if we take all evidence together, not just some isolated pieces of evidence, then the way of the majority of the total evidence points to an old earth view.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Oh, that's a very excellent. I'm sure that kind of refers to the, when you referred to the Chinese fossils where nervous systems had been.
Yes, that is remineralized. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so here's a kind of a lengthy question, and it has a scenario here. So if we suppose that in 2040 we invented self-replicating cars. So we make a single car in 2040 and then let it replicate. And then in 2045, we decide to make a new model with different design and features and new features. And then we let it replicate. And well, in 2052, we do the same. And then in 2060, and so on for thousands of years until the end of human civilization. Now, if other intelligent beings came along and started studying the fossils of cars, will the pattern of the car fossil record resemble the pattern of animal fossil record that we see today?
Yeah, that's a nice example. Actually, it would resemble the animal fossil record, but not totally. There would be one difference, to which I will come in a moment. The basic idea behind this analogy would be this idea that among Darwin critics would be represented by so-called progressive creationists, that you have, let's say, different phases in Earth history where there were acts of special creation of new groups, and then you had a kind of playing on the motif of these creations of these body plans, and you had minor variations, new species arising. That would be what he said. You have these self-replicating cars, so you would have a kind of Ford Cabrio, and then it would replicate, and you would have different versions of this Ford Cabrio by kind of common descent. But if you have a new Lamborghini, then this would be a new special creation, or the first electric car, and this would be a new special creation with a specially designed new type of engine. And then there could be some common descent going on in playing on this motif and having some different colors or different sizes of this type of car. So this would basically explain the fossil record in a way as well as progressive creation does. There's one problem, and that is the single problem why I'm reluctant to embrace this progressive creation view and rather tend towards a view of guided evolution with common ancestry. And that is the following. If we look at similarities between cars, these don't tend to be nested in a hierarchical way. So you could have a kind of, let's say, a limousine could be red, but also a truck could be red. But an electric car could be green, or another car could be. It's not nesting that you have electric cars, and then within electric cars you have different colors, and then there are some green, but there are no green cars outside of electric cars. It's not nesting of groups within groups, but if you would order, let's say you would make a kind of classification based on colors, and then you would make a classification based on horsepower, and then you would make a classification based on usage. Is it a sports car or a family car? Then they would not fall into groups within groups, but they would form overlapping groups because you can have these different attributes mixed in different ways. The strange thing in the fossil record, and also if you compare the morphology in living animals or living organisms, is that these similarities, not always, you have this phenomenon, very frequent phenomenon of convergence, but in a statistically significant way, they fall into a hierarchical pattern of groups nested within groups. And that has a consequence that you can make certain predictions. So for example, based on the assumed relationship of spiders with some other groups of arachnids, paleontologists about 10 years ago predicted that there should be fossil spiders which have a tail, even though there are no recent spiders with this kind of tail, like a scorpion, and there were no fossil spiders with such a tail. And just 2 years ago, it happens such spiders with a tail indeed have been discovered in 100 million years old Burmese amber. So this prediction has been confirmed. This is a prediction that is only possible based on this assumption of common ancestry, because it's not required. There's no reason why a design pattern would bring up this kind of distribution of the characters. That's the reason why I think this kind of guided, intelligently designed process with common ancestry best explains the evidence, because on the one hand you have these discontinuities, these infusions of new information in the system, but on the other hand the characters are distributed based on common ancestry in this hierarchical way. But it depends on all the evidence. The more conflicting evidence we could find, this could turn things around and require a revision of this view. But that's my current view. But of course, other intelligent design theorists came to other conclusions. You find all kinds of different views on this issue among ID theorists.
Yeah, so, and of course, if you had self-replicating cars, then you would also have to have the programming for that in place too.
Sure.
That's you know, kind of a separate issue. Well, let's go ahead and there's several questions that we received about dating, and I'm just I'll read them together and I'll let you answer them. Although I have a degree in chemistry, I often question the dating techniques as they give the impression that dating is flawless. And how are these dates determined? And then, do you believe that life on Earth really existed millions of years ago, as opposed to less than 10,000 years ago? And if so, what empirical research have you relied on to conclude that life existed millions of years ago?
Right. So basically, there are two questions. So the one question is, what about the reliability of the methods? So could they be totally off in terms of the dating? And the other is the question, why do I or other paleontologists believe in these millions of years? What kind of precise evidence is pointing into this direction? So first, about the reliability of the methods. One first has to understand that, of course, these methods have developed over decades, and some methods that may have had larger margins of error increasingly with refining the methods, testing the methods, have been perfected in a way that they have become more precise. Still, each dating method has a kind of error margin, and Unlike some popular publications, in the technical publications, you always find a dating, let's say 228 million years plus minus, and then you get some value of the error margin of this type of dating. Most of these precise dating, where you find these precise values at all, and not just a dating in a relative way that you say, well, that is probably Upper Cretaceous or something. So, stuff like this is based on identifying the layers and having this kind of index fossils. I could basically, if I have one layer which is dated by mollusk as Cretaceous, I could predict what kind of dragonflies will you find in this layer and what kind of dragonflies will you certainly not find in this layer. So with these index fossils, you can do this very rough dating. The precise dating, where you have these values, 200 something million years plus minus some 100,000 years. This is all based on radiometric methods. So most people think in terms of radiometric dating, of course, only carbon dating. But carbon dating doesn't play a big role or no role at all in paleontology, because carbon dating only goes back about 40,000 years back into the past. So this is used in archaeology, but it's still interesting because it's based on the same kind of reasoning, this process of dating by the decay of certain elements and some estimation about the decay rate and the daughter and mother isotopes to calculate what is probably the time that elapsed since these things lived or have been deposited. It's in a way like taking a candle, and if you know the candle was when it was bought 20 centimeters long and it burns every second so much millimeters. When you find it has burned down 10 centimeters, you can calculate how long did the candle burn before it was blown out. So in carbon dating, of course, we can compare in the historical record carbon dates with historical data. And what we find there is that there is a pretty good match. Of course, there's some error margin, and it can happen that dates are sometimes 20, 40 years off, or also if they go back 2 or 3 or 4,000 years, could also be sometimes 100 or 200 years off, plus minus. But basically they fit very well, which is the reason why even young earthers accept carbon dating for archaeological purposes after the flood. But they reject it before the flood, and then they have to have an explanation why this changed. And they say, well, there were some physical things going on in the flood that made a change, and it works afterwards, but not before, which doesn't really make too much sense and sounds a little bit like a very much ad hoc hypothesis. But the same procedure is used for other isotopes. And so for getting older dates, we have, for example, the UPB, which is using uranium and lead isotopes, where you can date back some 100 million years. A similar thing is possible with Kalium and argon isotopes. And they are there's evidence that they are reliable in the way that we have many layers that have been dated with different of these methods, and the values converge to a similar age, which tells you something that the truth is not too far from these estimated ages, because why should different methods all converge to the same age? So that was one, the reliability. The other question is what evidence points to millions of years. One, of course, is the radiometric dating. Also the question, why aren't there more isotopes that have a half-life younger than, let's say, 80 million years or something? Why have all those isotopes basically disappeared from Earth? Which indicates there has been time going on longer than that, or you need ad hoc hypothesis. And of course, the crucial question for most people who come from a biblical perspective is this calculation, as it was already done by Bishop Usher, of a timeline. Let's say the Earth is 6,000 years old, and then about 4,200 years you have the flood and so on. is this calculation true or is it not? And then people will not care if the Earth is 200,000 years old or 10 million years or 4.5 billion years. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And then, of course, if you have this kind of literal interpretation of Genesis, then you may have a problem. So there is a lot of evidence that this timeline is impossible. And I really explored this issue, also sympathetic to the young Earth view, to get a shot and try to make this work, but it's totally impossible with the evidence. And you have to basically come up with crazy ad hoc hypotheses to explain the evidence away. Just some easy things. There are fossil reefs, sponge reefs, but also other types of marine reefs that are 50 meters in height. And they are embedded in layers where beneath the reefs you have maybe terrestrial layers and then marine layers and then terrestrial layers and marine layers. And above the reefs you have the same thing. And in between you have these reefs. And it's totally impossible that all this stuff could have grown within 1 year of a global flood. That's not possible biologically. There are other things, for example, there are skeletons of whales. When a whale died today, he sinks to the ground, and then you have communities of invertebrates colonizing these carcasses of the whales on the seafloor. This is called whale fall communities. And there you can find that first you have this type of marine invertebrate colonizing the decaying body, and then they disappear and another group takes over. And we find this in fossils as well. And we have this, for example, for fossils of ichthyosaur skeletons, where we see that there were years of colonizing of these skeletons by different invertebrate groups, which show that this cannot fit into this narrative of a 1 year flood. And there's so much out there, these layers in lakes where you can count the annual layers deposited in winter and in summer, and you find in the summer layers pollen and in the winter layers no pollen, and you have 100,000 of these layers, and microscopically you cannot distinguish them from the layers that are formed today by seasons. And so there is heavy evidence from radiometric dating, but a lot of other evidence also that points to an old age of the Earth. So I have no doubt about that. But I understand that some people who have a certain theological interpretation of Genesis have theological reasons to believe in a young Earth. And I think this is legit if you have this theological view. The only thing you cannot do is appeal to science really points to this. And that is not true. Science clearly points to an old Earth.
And it's kind of interesting because, some people might counter that and they would say, well, if we're in a created reality, the creator could make it look like anything. So maybe he made it look old.
Yeah, sure. That is the belly button argument. So maybe this was created with the appearance of age, but this has, of course, also a theological cost, because it would mean we are in a way fooled by the creator to believe that the universe is old, even though it is not, which has also some unappealing consequences concerning a God who is truth itself. And so I understand the argument, but I don't like it for theological reasons.
Here's an easier question, Günter. Someone submitted a question from their son, and it says, my son asks, what is the oldest known dinosaur fossil? And is it even a dinosaur? Or is it, for example, an archosaur?
Okay, yeah, that is a question that probably is often asked by children who ask what was the biggest dinosaur, the most dangerous dinosaur, and the oldest dinosaur. So until recently, the oldest dinosaurs came from the Triassic of Argentina. These are layers that are about 230 million years old, ranging from 228 to 231. And these are forms like Eoraptor and Eodromeus and Herrerasaurus. These were early bipedal dinosaurs from the Triassic of Argentina. Recently, there have been some discoveries of dinosaurs that are significantly older. There has been one find, which probably is the oldest dinosaur, from Tanzania in Africa. and that is Nyasasaurus. And Nyasasaurus has been dated to an age of about 245 million years. That's also Triassic, but about 15 million years older than the Argentinian discoveries. It is a very early dinosaur. The affinities are still discussed. It has first been considered as a prosauropod. That is controversial, but it is certainly either a dinosaur or a very early precursor of dinosaurs. This question of archosaur, by the way, wouldn't be asked by a modern paleontologists, because archosaurs earlier in older times were used as for a group that preceded the dinosaurs. Nowadays, archosaur is the term in the classification of organisms that is used for the group that includes birds, dinosaurs, pterosaurs, crocodiles, maybe even turtles, and all other fossils that are more related to them than to others. So dinosaurs would also be archosaurs in this view.
Interesting. All right, let's go on to, here's a couple of questions about books, textbooks. And it says, is it possible to debunk the school book images of a clear lineage of fossils without all the complicated details? Now, I'm just going to weigh in on this because I have some background.
No. that is, of course, not possible, because you cannot debunk science, which is always a little bit complicated, with something easy. Then you have to go to the details and have to show why is a particular image false. So in most cases, I think the easiest thing to say is that most of these pictures are false by definition, because in modern paleontology and also in modern phylogenetics, which is this research of looking for relationships and reconstructing these trees, the method is not even suited to identify direct ancestor and descendant relationships. What they identify are so-called sister group relationships. So group A is more closely related to group B than to group C. But if it is a cousin or a brother or a direct ancestor, is the method cannot say. So that is one reason why most of these images are, let's say, simplified to illustrate an idea about evolution, but it's not really what a evolutionist would claim in a technical paper. Most of these lineages, if it is horses, where you have this progression from 5-toed or 4-toed Eocene horses to modern 1-toed horse, or in elephants, and where they go bigger and bigger and getting bigger tusks and bigger ears and so on, or in the human lineage, where you have ape form progressing to a more modern human form, and or the whale lineage, where you have these pig-like ancestors and then marine whales. The general pattern of this kind of progression of intermediate forms is in most cases correct and is based on actual data, and is the most elegant explanation of the data, which is also why I support this idea of common ancestry. These intermediate forms indeed look like they have some of the primitive character of the assumed ancestor and some of the derived characters of the assumed descendants, and are so in a way morphologically or anatomically intermediate. Another problem is if this is really telling anything about the crucial question of is this an unguided process? Did this happen just by natural law and by natural processes and random mutations, or has it been guided? And that is also why this claim, oh, evolution is a fact and it's proven by so many pieces of evidence, is true and is false at the same time. It is true for a common ancestry. It's not a fact, but it's a well-supported theory based on the evidence. But it's totally untrue for this claim of an unguided natural process of transformation. There's almost no evidence that this that supports this on the level of the major transitions. There is some evidence that this happens on low level of a population or between species, that you can have drug resistance evolving in germs in a petri dish, no question. You can observe this in a lab. And also that closely related species within a genus could probably go back to an ancestor of the same species, and that this speciation didn't require, it could be caused by intelligent intervention, but it could be explained without intelligent intervention just by Darwinian mechanisms. But only because you can explain how 10 species of finches originated from one species of finch doesn't mean that you can explain how you got finches in the first place, or feathers from other precursors, structures of the skin. Yes. So this is one thing to address this question. There's of course a more general issue of textbooks and what enters textbooks, for what reason, and why do certain things stay in textbooks even though they are either controversial or even refuted. So this depends on the subject, of course, and in the teaching of evolution, it is meanwhile a worldview question, and there are certain reasons why material is selected to be put in textbooks for educational purposes, to really hammer this worldview into the minds of the young people that are then exposed to this material. There are certain examples that are very suggestive. So for example, these Haeckel's embryos, and if you first look at it, it looks very convincing. And then you dig a little bit on the internet and Google it, and you find out not only that this has been criticized by intelligent design proponents like Jonathan Wells, but that even mainstream evolutionists meanwhile admit that this was fraudulent, and that this has been basically falsified evidence by Haeckel. And it's still used in the textbook because it is so handy and it is so convenient to get the message around with these examples, even though they have been refuted. And this is a reason why much of this material is still in the textbook. And that is, of course, a reason why you still find this evolutionary progression from some gibbon-like monkey or ape to a modern, mostly white European human at the end of the lineage. This goes back to diagrams and graphics that have been done in the time of Haeckel, and with a little bit evidence, certainly also from social Darwinism, and that are still used because they are so I don't even know how to really put it. They are in a graphical way so convincing because they are easy to grasp. You don't have to explain a lot. You just look at it and it looks like, oh, okay, that looks like one form is morphing into the other. Of course, if we really look at the fossil record, the picture is much more complicated. You don't have this gradual progression. You have gaps, and you have, if you want to reconstruct relationships of these fossil humans, it turns out that there is no consensus on the tree of human fossils, because there's all kind of disagreement which group is related, which human fossil is related to other fossil hominins or ape-like forms. So often the science is much more complicated than the picture that you find in textbooks.
That's right. And students are not thinking critically. They just want to know what they need to know for the test.
Yes,
yes, so, nobody's thinking too critically about those, unfortunately. Or maybe they start thinking critically about those. But I know when I was a student, I just said, hey, well.
And even students are told as a lip service, you should think critically and you should question everything. But if then students would question stuff like this, then they would be told, this is crazy creationist propaganda, believe the science, and so on. So critical questions are only allowed so far, but don't question the ruling paradigm.
There you go. That's exactly how it happens. Okay, so we have a couple of other questions, and then we're almost to the end here. Let's see. Okay, this question deals with a mole-like part in a human body, and I'm assuming that they're talking about the little creature that digs underground, that
Yes.
kind of like a shrew or something.
Yeah.
And it says, what about the mole-like part in a human body that is seen while a baby is in its mother's womb? The book, Why Evolution is True, claims that it remains as we are evolved. And I think when they say evolved, I think they mean developed gradually, or maybe they mean evolved, I'm not sure, gradually from some chimpanzee-like ancestors.
Okay. I think we have to unpack this because the question is a little bit confused. So it basically refers to evidence from embryology, and that we have maybe similarities in early embryos that suggest that there could be something like a gill in fish, or there is some remnant of a tail, and therefore we evolved from animals that initially had a tail. I would basically agree with this interpretation, would say these kind of atavistic structures, or also in embryology, a kind of recapitulation of ancestral structures is elegantly explained by common ancestry. In many cases, though, what looked like structures that were ancestral later turned out to be not so, when we had more knowledge about the embryology, or maybe also about the genetic underpinnings. But in many cases, there is embryological evidence that can be interpreted in this way. I don't really understand what he means by mole-like structure, if he refers to the initial buds of the limbs and hands that look a little bit like the digging parts of moles, but nobody would claim that this is based on evolutionary relationship. Yeah, but generally, I see no big problem because my problem is the transformation process, and that this cannot be explained in an unguided way. But the evidence for common ancestry, I'm happy to grant and say, well, this is good explained by common ancestry, but that doesn't explain how we got, as Steve Meyer put it in a very good video on YouTube, how you got from bacteria to Beethoven.
Yeah, there you go. So that's quite something. So that, yeah, and so the author of this question didn't get into a whole lot of specifics. So we'll just take your answer as it is. And then here's another question. I understand that ape-like fossils compared to human-like fossils show a very large difference with no bridging fossils.
Yeah,
and
yeah, that is definitely true. And this is also sometimes misrepresented in popular science stuff that you can find in journals like Scientific American or National Geographic, or also in the school textbooks, where it looks like you have this continuous line from ape-like forms to the genus Homo, and then you have Homo erectus, and then Neanderthalensis, and then modern humans. That is not so, and that is actually not so based on studies by mainstream evolutionary paleoanthropologists. So that is those kinds of paleontologists that especially work on the human fossil record. And there has been a paper in the year 2000 by one of the most well-reputed paleoanthropologists, which is John Hawkes. And he has shown in his paper that there is a large discontinuity, a large gap between the ape-like forms, which are the Australopithecines, and their possible precursors in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, and the first representatives of the genus Homo. There is a single exception, and that is Homo habilis. The problem with Homo habilis is that it turned out to be a kind of wastebasket taxon, which includes bones that couldn't be attributed to other forms, and that are very likely, and that is not something that creationists or intelligent design proponents say, that is something that is hotly discussed in mainstream paleontology, that this is maybe an invalid taxon, and that these bones of Homo habilis are not related and are belonging to different species, some of them more ape-like forms, some of them more human-like forms. But basically, there's a large discontinuity between the Australopithecines and the genus Homo. And this also translates, by the way, if we go within Homo and we look at the real modern humans, which also then have this kind of symbolic behavior, which I showed in my lecture, where you find about 40,000 years ago, this development where you suddenly find ivory carvings and jewelry and cave paintings and so on. This correlates with a discontinuity in an anatomical feature. If you look at a skull, and especially the brain case of, let's say, a Homo erectus, a Neanderthal, and relatively old so-called modern humans, they have a very elongate brain case and very similar among them. So the first representatives of Homo sapiens looked like Neanderthals in terms of their elongate brain shape. What we have, if you look at my skull with the lack of hair, you can see it very well, is this globular shape of the brain case. And that is distinctive for a group of Homo sapiens. Just the real oldest fossil record is just 30 to 40,000 years ago. And this correlates very well with the symbolic behavior. And I am inclined to think that really modern humans, really humans, in the sense of humans that have the image of God in theological terms, that is not, of course, a scientific question, but if we interpret the science then from a certain theological point of view, then I think the evidence that this kind of sophisticated behavior that indicates this is a form that is really thinking about itself, persisting in time. I'm still the same human as 5 minutes before or a year before, and I care about what is there maybe life after death, and all this kind of stuff that is suggested by the symbolic behavior. This correlates with this discontinuity in the anatomy of the human fossil record. So there are definitely gaps, and it's not a continuous line. And there's also, if you look at the early lineages and these early forms of Australopithecine-like forms, they have all weird kind of combinations of features that don't align in a progression, where you would say, you have first smaller forms with a less developed bipedal gait and a small brain and still ape-like skull. No, you have some forms that are small, but have a modern flat face, but have an ape-like hip, and have long fingers that indicate that we're climbing in the trees. And then you have other forms that are much bigger, have bipedal gait, but have a small brain. And then you have others that have a big brain, but have still ape-like arms and so on. So crazy things that suggest it's certainly not true that you have this easy development, ape at the beginning and human at the end. It doesn't look like this. And this is not supported by the fossil record.
Interesting. Okay, so let's see. Here's another couple questions. Okay, how do we use paleontology for ID research? And specifically, can you summarize the argument that paleontology reflects intelligent design?
Right. So I would make it in two parts. One would be the negative argument, and that is, of course, the critique of the Neo-Darwinian mechanism, and showing if this doesn't fit the evidence, then we have to find some other explanation. So this is something that is often critiqued by critics of intelligent design. They say you only have this kind of negative argument, and it's on one hand, it's a God of the gaps argument because you just cannot explain it and therefore God did it, which is not true. It's not an argument from ignorance. The design inference is based on what we do know, what can explain causally the origin of new information. And we know it, that can only an intelligent mind, a conscious agent can introduce new specific information into a system. So it's not a God of the gaps argument. But also if we look at the whole kind of reasoning, there is something that has been called the Sherlock Holmes fallacy. And the Sherlock Holmes, if you remember, Sherlock Holmes has written in some of his novels, if you have excluded everything that is impossible, then whatever remains, how unlikely it may seem, must be the truth. This or similar, he put it, or Dr. Watson said it, I don't remember, but that is the Sherlock Holmes argument. This is sometimes wrongly called a fallacy because it is only a fallacy if you haven't excluded all other alternatives. And then, of course, if you have excluded all other alternatives, then the remaining alternative must be true. The critic is you cannot exclude all alternatives, and therefore you never know if there are some other alternatives around, and therefore you cannot say only because you have refuted neo-Darwinism, that doesn't mean that intelligent design is true, because there could be some other natural process. I would counter this with the following. There is a reason why Richard Dawkins said only Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And there's a reason why Daniel Dennett, the famous atheist philosopher of mind, said Darwin's dangerous idea and this Darwinian idea of random variation and natural selection is a kind of universal acid that is all removing all these crazy superstitious ideas. This Darwinian process is the only idea that mankind in 2000 years or longer of Western philosophy and science ever came up with to explain how you could get complex information from simple beginnings by a natural bottom-up process. If it can be shown that this process is not feasible mathematically, but also conflicted by the empirical evidence, then it's not just one theory of many that is thrown out of the window, but the only naturalistic alternative is then gone, and then we have to go to intelligent design as the only man standing. So that is the one part of the argument. So the negative argument to show with the fossil record that neo-Darwinism is contradicted by the empirical evidence is one part to make the argument. The other part is a argument from this waiting time problem, where we can show the genetic information that was required, for example, to make a marine whale from a pig-like ancestor in the available window of time, accepting all the phylogenetic relationship, accepting common ancestry, accepting all the datings. Still, the window of time is orders of magnitude too short, based on the standard textbook mathematical apparatus of population genetics. And we're currently doing a research project on that, and will show with the calculations that this is true in the example of whales, but also in many, many other examples, and is the general rule for all these major transitions. And this means not only that the neo-Darwinian process is mathematically not feasible, but that we can make an inference to the best explanation. What process do we know in our universe by repeated observation that can introduce new information in short periods of time into a system? And it is only the activity of a conscious mind. And therefore the inference to intelligent design is then an inference to the best explanation and not an argument from ignorance. And that, I think, are the two pillars of the intelligent design argument from paleontology.
Yes, I remember years ago reading William Dembski's book called Intelligent Design, and he makes that case about the time problem, and he talks about the mathematics, and the math doesn't work. So I thought that was really interesting. Okay, so okay, are you planning to release a book?
Yes. Short answer, yes. Longer answer, not only one, but I'm actually working in parallel on manuscripts of 3 books. The first that will hopefully be ready for publication towards end of next year will be something like the Big Bangs of life, and will refer to also the subject of my talk. So these large discontinuities in the fossil record, these explosive events that question the Darwinian narrative in the fossil record. Another book that I plan has a working title, something like Hard Rock, Soft Science, and refers to questionable interpretations of the fossil record, showing that this whole discipline of interpreting fossil evidence often leads to over-interpretation and to very questionable scientific publication, which later turn out to be completely rubbish. But there are several reasons why this happens. There's one, this publish and perish paradigm that let's say is an incentive for scientists to publish sensational stuff quickly to get a job. But it's also the general problem of fossils that it's not like you have a modern animal with all the data and the detailed morphology. It's basically like doing systematics with roadkill, or like insects that are flattened on your windscreen on the car, or even worse. And of course, there are a lot of lacking evidence, things that cannot be preserved or that are not available, like genetic data, that then lead to incorrect interpretations. And I will show a lot of those cases in this book, and I'm collecting material for this. And the third book will be on my personal story, how I moved from a hardcore Darwinian materialist atheist to a critic of Darwinism and to a theist.
That's great. That is just absolutely fabulous. We'll look forward to all three of those. And
don't expect all three of them next year. It will take a little bit longer.
That's a lot of work if you're going to get them out next year. That's a big order. So Günter, there's a couple of people that actually several people that have asked. This is like kind of a follow-up question. One, where can we contribute to your work financially if we wanted to make a donation? And do you have a link for this?
So first, thank you for the very well intentions. Yes, it's possible. So if you want to support, let's say, especially intelligent design related work, or work that addresses the issue, is there real purpose in nature? Then we have this Center for Biocomplexity and Teleology in Nature. The website is biocomplexity.at. And on this website, already on the homepage, you find links to possibilities to make donations by PayPal or other means. That's, of course, always welcome and is supporting research projects in this field. And also PR work and organizing conferences in the German-speaking realm. But if you want to support, let's say, more international efforts and global efforts to address these issues of critique of Darwinism, intelligent design theory, criticism of materialism, then I would strongly suggest to go to the website of Discovery Institute and make a donation to Discovery, where not just me, but a lot of scientists of the intelligent design movement are supported in their research effort, like Richard Sternberg and Jonathan Wells and Stephen C. Meyer and Engager and Doug X and so on.
Yes, and so thank you very much for that, Günter. And I know one of the things I'm going to do is when I send out this video, and I'm going to put some links on there to support both the Discovery Institute. As I told you, somebody gave me the book Intelligent Design, and of course I'm a science. My background is in the physical sciences and engineering, so I picked this up not knowing what to think. But I've always had that question, because I couldn't put together faith issues with my science. But I read this and I was like, okay, this guy, what he's saying makes sense about the mathematics. And then I read one of Michael Denton's books, Evolution of Theories in Crisis. And then one thing led to the next. And pretty soon I was reading all these books by all these people, Stephen C. Meyer, Signature in the Cell. And then pretty soon I was like, oh my God, this is amazing what these people have to say. So I will include links for those things. This talk and this follow-up question and answer session have been brought to you by the Science and Culture Network of Southern California, and also in collaboration with our colleagues in the Colorado chapter. And someday, maybe there will be chapters all over the place. I believe there's some kind of chapter system kind of forming in the United Kingdom, and possibly, who knows, in Germany. I don't know, but we, we are a project, if you will, of the Discovery Institute. And so what we do is we support people like yourself to come and speak to our group. And of course, when we started, we had local events, and we would have our first event, we had Stephen C. Meyer and Dr. Doug Axe come and talk in Orange County, which is, for those of you who are not in the Southern California area, it's like Los Angeles, you go south. and it's the Orange County, and people in Orange County it's not quite to San Diego, but in any case, that was our first event. And so it takes a lot of money to put these on, and it takes a lot of, resources to have people like yourself be able to do this research and to write books and that sort of thing. And so we will be sure to put the links out, and anyone who wants to support Dr. Bechly and his work, we will put that information out for you. And we will also put out the information about, you can go to his website if you're German speaking. You can go to his Center for Biocomplexity and Natural Teleology. Did I say it right?
Yeah, that's the title in German.
Okay, good. In English. So in any case, thank you so much, Günter. I really appreciated your taking the time to thoroughly answer all these great questions that we had. And we'll look forward to having you back when you're one of these books comes out.
Yeah, cool. So thank you for having me. It was fun. And yeah, of course, I'm happy to come back with a book in my hands.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to that, Dr. Bechly. Thank you very much.